welcome to this webinar. Thank you for being with us. And lots of people and lots of excitement about the presentation. Looking forward for it, and it's all yours. So please start.
Excellent. Thank you very much for your invitation. I'm absolutely delighted to see that Metaphorum is growing and becoming more and more relevant for the VSM community. So very, very nice to see all these people around, and hopefully we will have a good time. As I mentioned, are you hearing me all right?
Yes, perfect, yes.
Yeah. As I said to Angela, I am quite happy to receive questions in the process. Just follow your pace. On the other hand, if you decide that you don't want to make questions this time, I will just run for about 45 minutes.
So we can do as before.
Angela, can you get everybody to mute? Get everybody to mute because there's too much noise.
Oh, yes. Okay. Thank you very much. I will do that. Let me see.
Just ask everybody.
Yes, I think that.
If I mute, I think you will not hear anything.
No, everybody except you, please. So anyway, I think that we are now ready. If anyone wants have a comment or a chat or a question, please put them in the chat, and we'll do as we normally do. I'll take the questions and ask them to Raul later on. And as he says, if somebody is really wanting to interrupt for an important question, please do. Okay. So, okay, it's all yours.
Thank you very much. As you see, the title of my presentation is the Enterprise Complexity Model, an extension of the Viable System model for emerging organizational forms. So in effect, I'm sorry, but you have to go through the traditional VSM, and then later on it will become more clear what is the extension that I'm talking about. So a bit of history so that we can essentially we can share what is my background in this. As I think most of you know, I was in Chile at the time of the CyberSyn project, and quite naturally, after the coup, I came to the UK, and I had a very powerful interaction with Stafford during those years, particularly the 70s. I witnessed through the 1970s his writing of the heart of enterprise. And I can only say, without going into much praising and all that, that I can only say that the viable system model is an extraordinary invention in my view. And the thing that I am recognizing is that increasingly is receiving creative contributions from many people. So that's what I would like to see, that what I present today somehow supports the further development of new developments. I have used the viable system model extensively, and I have used it in many, many organizations, companies, and governments, and all that. And my purpose in this interaction is reporting strictly about the enterprise complexity model, but grounded in the model that we are talking about. It was through this work that I developed a deep insight of the law of requisite variety, in particular of the residual variety and organizational systems. These are two aspects that you will see I will be highlighting as we talk. Both of them underpin the Y-plan method and the Y-plan methodology. Both were aspects of my work during the 80s, and that's what I would like. The enterprise complexity model started to evolve from my days at Aston University, which were in the 80s. And I have to pay tribute to two people who helped me throughout those years, and those were John Watt, who still is alive but very old, and Nigel Howard, who unfortunately died. But also I had the support of a number of doctoral students, including Angela, Roger Harden, and Alfonso Reyes. Out of my work with Angela came an important application of the VSM to the National Auditing Office of Colombia. That was perhaps, in my own view and in my own history, the most significant application after CyberSyn. After with her, we worked in that. She was instrumental in making possible that project. And with Roger, I edited a book which was the Viable System Model, Interpretations and Applications of Stafford Beer's VSM. That was a model, a book that, in my view, helped to bring together a number of very important contributors to the ideas of organizational cybernetics. And with Alfonso Reyes, with Alfonso, I wrote the book Organizational Systems, Managing Complexity with a Viable System Model, which in fact has an important influence in what I'm going to say today. In addition to these three major inputs I had from students, doctoral students, I had hundreds of master students, and hundreds did dissertations with me. In my bookshelves, I have these all this work of my students, and they were extremely interesting and important. Some of them worked with me at Cinco Limited. Now, this was a company I formed at the Aston Science Park in 1985. And in particular, I want to mention Anthony and Antonia Gill and Diane Bowling. They all had influence in the things that I'm going to mention. Over time, I decided to close the Cinco Limited, and now it's only Cinco Research. So it's an outlet for my own research. So I think aspects of epistemology, methodology, and the VSM. And I think the fundamental aspects I want to talk about the black box and the operational descriptions of organizational systems. In my practice, the application of the VSM goes beyond philosophical labels. I have found complementarity between a black box and an operational description of organizational systems. The fallacy of black box descriptions are inputs and outputs to the systems and respond to what often is referred to as first-order cybernetics or the cybernetics of observed systems. So that is the black box description. But the fallacy of the operational description are the relationships producing an organizational system, which can be understood as second-order cybernetics or the cybernetics of observing systems. So these are the two basic ways I have used the viable system model, and what I have found is that they are complementary. So they are not one or the other. They are very much complementary. And the focus of the Viplan method, which is the one that I apply to black box enterprises as black boxes, the focus of this is the Viplan method, is on the strategies to manage the complexity of an organizational system's transformations from inputs into outputs. That is talking about productivity. This method helps working out levels of recursion in organizational systems through technological and structural models which recognize constraints in the environment. So the key aspect of this is recognizing constraints in the environment. And here we have constraints that I have worked substantially in are technological, geographical, marketing, and time constraints. These are the basic ideas of the Viplan method, where we start with a conversation about identity. And in this is a discussion about purposes that the group of people in that particular enterprise want to pursue. And from this discussion of identity and purpose follows a structural modeling, which is where I work out the environmental constraints. And from there is that unfolding of complexity emerges, and it is there that we have autonomous systems within autonomous systems, which leads to a further distribution of complexity in what I call distribution of discretion. Once we have the unfolding of complexity and we have the distribution of discretion, we are ready to start working with the viable system model in both modes, in the mode of diagnosis and the mode of designing. And this is the study of the organizational regulatory mechanisms. So in order to help work out or show where is that the connection between constraint and the basic ideas of complexity of the organizational system come, I use one of these diagrams that most of you possibly have seen, and that is in Stafford's Heart of Enterprise, and you can go to page 47 if you wish. Now, in this description, what you have is a black box, and it shows something that is very special. It shows that even for very simple boxes, black boxes. In this case, a black box with 8 inputs and 1 output, and each of them with 2 possible states, 0 or 1, you can generate a variety of 2 to the power of 2 to 56, 256, which is an extraordinary large number. So even a very small black box has the potential to generate huge variety. And how is it handled, that variety? Essentially, we know it is handled by attenuation, by, in this case, is adaptation to constraint. I want to, what we do is we split the black box, in this case, in the example that you're seeing, in 2 boxes, each of them with 4 inputs and 1 output. And suddenly, in a magical way, now we have a variety of 2 to the 17. And that is incredibly small as you compare to the previous one. And eventually, we sometimes still find that is difficult to handle, and we start to move into fragmentation. And the fragmentation in the bottom line of this diagram is 8 boxes, each with 1 input and 1 output. So it is at this level that you basically lack systemic sensibility. You are fragmenting the situation to a point that is not useful in order to understand the environmental aspects that we are dealing with. However, what I think is interesting to realize is that split of the black box in the second middle row there is the one that I connect to the fragment to the aspects of market, time, and aspects of technology, and essentially all the problems that we connect to reducing, finding out in the environment fundamental constraints that are helpful to support how we produce that break of the original very complex, chaotic black box into things that are manageable. And it is there that we need to have special attention into finding out connectivity that we can chunk into one chunk of complexity, and then have several of these chunks, and we generate within each chunk as much connectivity as we can possibly master, and have in between the plus sign there is where we have the connections between these chunks. That is the process by which we move from chunking the complexity of the of the environment into autonomous units, and that's what we call the unfolding of complexity. That is, systems with subsystems, with sub-subsystems, and that is the unfolding of complexity that I think we have seen in use for a long time. Each of these has, hopefully, each of these autonomous units has organizational closure, following the ideas of Maturana and Varela. And then for each of these, in the table recursion function is what shows us how to distribute complexity through the different autonomous units. So I will not explain more that, but that shows the Y-plan method as the basic starting point for our conversation. But the operational description of an organizational system is what really I find it most interesting at this point. So, well, through the Y-plan method, we recognize autonomous units within autonomous units and the distribution of complexity within an enterprise in relation to its environment. With the operational description, we are talking about relationships. These relationships that I am putting here are first the performance relationship, which in fact is very much the one that relates to the embodiment of the complexity of the organizational system in relation to its surroundings, in relation to its environment. And it is here that there is this learning process of a performative organization dealing with its environment, its surroundings. And the performance that we develop in this case is starting from productivity and latency. So from productivity is that we are dealing with inputs and outputs, as explained just a minute ago. And with latency, I think this is particularly interesting. With latency, we are talking about the stretching of that organizational systems are experiencing in their interactions with problematic environments. So in this case, we are talking about enterprises that are dealing with, for instance, education, enterprises that are dealing with manufacturing, with health, and so on. And all of them have some form of stretching coming from the surroundings, from the environment, and that's the stretching that somehow allows them to, the organizational system, to work out its latency. And naturally, productivity is related to input-output, and this is recursive in the ways that we know. The second relationship that I am very much interested in is the relationship of cohesion. And the cohesion is, as you know, those of you who know about the viable system model, know clearly that cohesion is related to the relations between those who are steering the organization into its environment and the autonomous units that are producing the activities that the organization or the enterprise wants to develop. In this case, what is interesting is to see that these resources, these resources bargaining between cohesion and implementation, these resources bargaining require, in order to make it manageable, coordination, and that is what Stafford calls systems 2, and that this coordination is very strongly connected to the abilities of people to support each other, to understand each other, to help in the end to solve problems together without necessarily the need to go to a boss of any kind. And so coordination is crucial as a way of absorbing variety locally. And the other side is what we know is auditing. And auditing is in the way that I've been using it is related to trust, to responsible trust. So rather than just receiving reports coming from the autonomous units, I think it is very important to have relationships of responsible trust where people understand in the cohesion function what the people in implementation are saying when they propose their programs and plans. And the third relationship that I think is important is the one of policy making, and is policy purposes and values in connection to cohesion and intelligence. And that's where what you find is that when the people in the organization work out purposes, work out policies that they want, they are implicitly establishing what kind of resources they need to recognize the complexity of the environment and what kind of resources they need to recognize the complexity of the inner organization. And it's that relationship between intelligence and cohesion that in the end is the one that helps to build up stretching or to respond to the stretching of the environment. The fourth relationship is the one of inclusion. That is the one of local, global. So what you have is local environments related to the autonomous units within the organization, and they have the same problems of responding to huge complexity, and they have the same problems of dealing with external and internal problems and so on. But what is very interesting, and I have found that very useful, is that these are there are relationships between the local environments and the global environments, and that's what I have put as number 4 there. And that's where the understanding that people at the local level develop somehow creeps up to the stretching environment, problematic environment. And that, in a way, is very important to complete the loop of the interactions between environment and organization. And the relationship 5 is organizational citizenship, which I will not explain it now. I will explain it later on, or say a few words about that later on. But what is important is together all these relationships and resources create, regulate, and produce the enterprise's purposes. That's what that diagram is showing. They are creating the policies and purposes and directions of the organization. They are regulating the implementation, and they are producing whatever the enterprise is producing. So that's the idea of focus on relationships. And as you can imagine, all of these are relationships between and among people in order to, that are observing each other and are in a way producing what we would recognize as second order cybernetics. As shown in the diagram above, beyond institutions and individual enterprises, the focus of the Bible system, of the Viplan methodology, is relationships between networks and networks of enterprises. And that's the point I want to reinforce at this stage. So I make the distinction between institutions and organizations. Institutions are the ones that legally are being set up as enterprises, as departments of state, or whatever we may call, and them. And a completely different thing is when we talk about organizational systems. Organizational systems go beyond individual enterprises. So the relationships to create, regulate, and produce an organizational system's purposes are at the core of the enterprise complexity model. So that's where I come into the addition that I think is coming here. The methodology is intended to help improving the organizational responses to problematic situations. So we start with what is natural and perhaps every day more difficult in our experience, and that is problematic situations like the ones of COVID-19, like the ones of environmental sustainability. All these are huge problematic situations that need to be handled by organizational responses. And these organizational responses are the ones that we want to understand better how to generate. So together, the viable system model, the VIPLAN methodology, and the VIPLAN method help developing the enterprise complexity model, which is visualized as a distributed governance model of an ecology of networked enterprises guiding the enterprise's collective self-organization. So that's where we are moving beyond the viable system model as a model of an enterprise. We are moving into enterprise complexity models, which are helping us to visualize distributed governance. The challenge is local self-organization towards more global values and policies creating, regulating, and producing products and services, and are deemed necessary to handle societal problems, like the ones I have already mentioned. An enterprise complexity model is an enterprise strategy to manage relevant complexity in a highly dynamic niche market. It requires reflexivity and an ongoing reconfiguration of resources, communications, and relationships to produce a responsive organizational system to handle problem situations such as the ones I have already mentioned. So the VIPLAN methodology, I have expressed it in two loops. The first loop is the cybernetic loop, which is reflected by the black arrows there. And the second one is the learning loop, which is reflected by the white arrows in there. So, and as you can recognize there, these loops are learning loops, are starting by observation, naming systems, designing responses, and implementing responses. So we start in the case of the learning loop with big data of enterprise actors and sustainable environment. I'm focusing in this case on sustainability. And the cybernetic loop is connected to particular enterprises of global nature in society, handling the sustainability issues of that country or nation or region. From there, we generate names for enterprises and in focus and for its problematic ecology. And from there, in the learning loop, we are dealing with the problem situations, the environmental ecology, and enterprise complexity models, which I relate, and I will show in a minute more, to liquid enterprises, performance in sustainable development goals, so that it is they are related to situations that go beyond one enterprise and that are requiring networks of enterprises. And that's what the enterprise complexity model is. And then to close the learning loop, we have the multiple enterprises in the enterprise complexity model are basically interacting and generating self-organization through correcting variety imbalances that they may experience. So that's the learning loop. And the cybernetic loop at the core is essentially starting from the particular enterprise in focus. So the particular enterprise in focus in the case of sustainability may well be the Department of Sustainability in the country or the Department of the Environment or whatever. Now, it is clear that this enterprise in focus, it has its own structure, and it is in a way producing some kind of responses to the world in which the problematic situation is triggering the need for responses. One of the crucial aspects of this cybernetic loop is the need to improve the cybernetics of the enterprise in its environment. So shall we say we have named the Department of Sustainability, and then we work out the organization structure of that department, and then we start to work out how to improve the cybernetics of that enterprise so that in effect it is handling the big data that is at the top of the diagram in the left side. So that's the initial point. But then what happens next is that very often these enterprises in focus are not organizational systems. They are not organizational systems with the capacity to create, regulate, and produce their own purposes. So it is very, very clear, very common that if you think about sustainability, that whoever is responsible for sustainability in the nation, country, or wherever, cannot possibly develop the three critical systems I have explained: the naming, the regulation, the creation, regulation, and production. So because they cannot produce themselves the sustainable responses to the situation in progress, the whole point is that at that stage, the real organizational system is the system that connects in this case, the sustainable, the Department for Sustainability communicates with a whole range of other regulatory bodies, with a whole range of other network enterprises. And it is together that they create what I'm calling the enterprise complexity model. So the enterprise complexity model is going beyond the particular enterprise that we may be looking at, and it is working out the whole network of enterprises, regulatory and with capacity for implementation. And that gives the direction to support the development of new interactions, new self-organization, new corrections of variety imbalances, and that's where I think we start to build up an organizational response, the response of an organizational system to the huge complexity of all these problems that we are dealing with. So, the dynamics of new enterprise complexity models in the network economy, new forms of transforming inputs into outputs are emerging constantly. It helps connecting the black box and the operational descriptions of an enterprise. Information and communication technologies, as well as new models, like, for instance, system dynamic models and others, are making possible networks and alternative forms of association for enterprises. Often enterprises, as defined by the system in focus, as I have already said, don't have the systemic functions necessary and sufficient for viability. That's it in the case of the ministries for the environment and education. In these cases, it is clear that they don't have the full set of systemic functions to make possible a viable system there. In this case, the enterprise complexity model is formed by networks of enterprises that increase the chances for effective performance in the system in focus in the environment. Perhaps where I have seen more clearly this distinction between an enterprise and the enterprise complexity model is in education. If we think about education, it is clear that the Department of Education in any of our countries is very much focused on policy making, is creating policies for education in the country. But clearly, the Department of Education is not going to regulate and produce education throughout the country. So it is clear that there will be many regulatory enterprises around. There will be many universities and schools and colleges and houses and households producing education in the country. So that in the end, the enterprise complexity model is the connection between creating the policy, which is the enterprise in focus, and is regulating and producing the education throughout the country. So that is the extension that I am making with all this idea of the enterprise complexity model. So from enterprises to enterprise complexity models and the embodiment of network of organizations. So our problem is the embodiment of network of organizations. As environmental pressures, and I have mentioned that the idea of stretching, increase an enterprise can vary significantly the configuration of its resources, including those implied by an enterprise complexity model, and this can happen in a relatively short term. So we have this stretching that comes from the world in which we operate with our institutions, and it is by making of these institutions organizational systems that have the capacity to regulate and respond to the demands of the environment, of the problems that we are dealing with, is that we move out of the enterprise in focus, establish the idea of the enterprise complexity model, and from there we start to move into the process of networking enterprises and creating organizations that have the capacity to generate policies, regulate these policies, and implement these policies. For the same, I'm repeating myself, for a public sector institution like the National Health Service, rather than providing traditional services directly, public institutions may manage the communications of public-private partnerships to provide them. So this is something that we are very aware of. But now we have a systemic model to recognize how these private partnerships, public-private partnerships, can come together into a larger organization. What is particular to this situation is the ingenious use of digital technology and scientific models to increase performance and competitiveness. So that's what we are trying to build up through the enterprise complexity model. New technologies may open the space for these matchings and offer opportunities. In general, for an enterprise, we can develop enterprise complexity models. That is a strategy to manage relevant complexity in highly dynamic niche markets. And this is reflexively as an ongoing reconfiguration of resources, communications, or relationships allowed to produce a more responsive organizational system. I think I need to go back to this diagram. I need to go back to this model and show how is this reflexivity happening. So it is clear that we have an enterprising focus, which may not be completely an organizational system with all the systemic functions that I have mentioned. And then we have an enterprise complexity model, which is trying to expand and develop networks so that they can handle the problem situation in a better way. So what is interesting is that these two loops, the cybernetic loop and the learning loop, are reflexively interconnected. So that this reflexivity means that as the problem situation generates new networks, and these networks of enterprises can generate new enterprise complexity models, they are telling the inner loop, the cybernetic inner loop, that the organizational system that they are running requires to be developed in order to increase the quality of the cybernetics of the interactions between the enterprise itself, which now has to pass from being an enterprise focused, particularly as in the case of education, being focused on policy, to one that increases communications with those that can generate the regulation and implementation. And as they do that, they change the loop, or the learning loop. And the learning loop is now recognizing that the organizational system is improving and is creating better conditions to handle the situation. And this is the reflexivity in this case is one loop changing the other, and vice versa, creating the chances for improving the loops in the two directions. So here it is a graphic representation of the enterprise complexity model. In this example, the enterprise complexity model embodied as a liquid enterprise, as a network of enterprises. So what I think from the work we did in Colombia, where Angela was instrumental, we developed at that time, and I personally developed archetypes. And I developed a whole range of archetypes to study organizations, to design organizations, and to diagnose organizations. In this case, I'm showing with the dotted lines of the larger circle, I'm showing that the boundaries of the organizational system are being liquid, are changing all the time. And these are these liquid enterprise is the one where we are embodying the enterprise complexity model. So interesting that we can do that in a very, very wide range of situations. So a general strategy to close the complexity gap between an enterprise and its environment is reconfiguring resources, relationships, and interactions. This is what we call dynamic capabilities. So that's a number of people in the States, Tees and others, have been working out the idea of dynamic capabilities. These efforts enable clusters to align their interests with relevant international, national, regional, and local enterprises. In addition to the institutions I have already mentioned, like education and environment, the company I created in the Aston Science Park was a typical example of a network of organizations which had the Aston Science Park as its the enterprise in focus. And it was the development of this enterprise in focus, the one that we, the enterprises, local enterprises, the tens of local enterprises were there to build up together an enterprise complexity model, which would help to develop the idea of a science park as an enterprise complexity model. The same happens with many of the enterprises that we are used to. Nike, I have put here as an example. Nike is an enterprise that is concerned with designing the apparel. And this design, the purpose that they have as Nike is designing the apparel and not producing that. And they create a network of enterprises throughout the world to generate Nike as an organizational, a network of organizations and an enterprise complexity model. And I think I have the feeling that I am already too late. And by the way, no one has interrupted me, which is a problem. But is that because you all have, you're muted? But never mind. I just want to finish to explaining the most recent development I have been involved in connection to the Viplan methodology. And that is the idea of ontological cybernetics. So one of the things that my colleagues in Russia, particularly Vladimir Levsky, who is an academician of the Russian Academy of Sciences, he has been pursuing the idea of third order cybernetics, which in my view makes no sense. And I think it makes sense in my view is this idea that we then came and we have published a paper with Vladimir around this, and that is the idea of ontological cybernetics. And that is the idea of the relationship 5 that I left untouched in the organizational system, in the diagram that I showed you at the beginning. And in this, the relationship 5 that is there is very significant. And that is a huge contribution of what Vladimir Levsky calls third-order cybernetics. I can recognize two types of environment that our organizational systems are dealing with. One is a systems environment, which is the relationship one that I showed in the operational VSM at the beginning. And the other one is its organizational citizenship, is the relationship of what we call organizational citizenship. And this is the fact that the enterprise and the enterprise network is in the context where things are modified and being changed constantly by culture and society and all aspects that are beyond the immediate environment of the enterprise. And that's the relationship of organizational citizenship. This work that I'm referring to started in Sweden, in fact, in my work with Claes Otto Wenne and others, where we worked in producing what we call the Riscom model. And that was a model to handle this embedding of organizational networks in larger enterprise, in larger societal needs. And it is in connection to the Swedish nuclear waste management system. So there was an enterprise focused on nuclear waste management, but there were many other organizations that were related to regulation and management of the nuclear waste management system. And these other regulators and policymakers were the ones that were providing the environmental framework for the work of the organization responsible for nuclear waste. So this was work that we did in the 1990s and the early parts of this. And that's where I would say we had an interesting outcome. Now, all of this is very much developed and explained in my book with Alfonso, Organizational Systems. In one of the last chapters, the penultimate chapter, is discussed this problem of the nuclear waste management system. And this book is both in English and Spanish. So that's where we are. And with that, I can only stop and say thank you for being so patient.
Thank you very much, Raul. It's really interesting. And
thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Raul. Yeah.
We have a few questions. So shall we go for the questions we have so far? We have Arthur. You want Arthur to make your comment?
Hi, Raul. Can you hear me, Angela?
Yes,
yes. Sorry, where are you?
Okay.
Sorry, okay. I can't see you.
My video should be on, but at least you can hear me, Raul.
I can hear you, yes.
Okay, great. I have two remarks, questions. I have not hear you speaking about nomination of the essential variables. Do you think they are relevant? And if yes, in what part of the process of describing an organization in terms of the viable system should you nominate these essential variables?
I think, thank you for that. I think as you hopefully will see that the relationship of performance is the one that is generating this recognition of essential variables.
Okay, so when you introduce the concept of performance, there I should find guidelines for the nomination of the essential variables.
Essential variables.
Okay. And Steve Brewis is also on the line, and you maybe recall that I showed you my unfolding of a network airline using the logic of value production for nominating my recursions. And have you considered using value production maybe as a decision tool for making choices about which constraint in the environment you are going to use for nominating a recursion? I hope I was clear to express this.
I think you are clear, and I think value production in the environment to recognize constraints. Is that the question that you are putting?
Yes.
As you easily can recognize, is that there is no way I could go through the whole thing. And the thing that I mentioned is that in the Viplan method, we had several modeling tools to recognize the constraints in the environment. And one of these tools, these modeling tools, is precisely the idea of value chains, value production, and so on. So that in the end, as part of the process of working out the units, the autonomous units, is that you need to have pay attention to the value chain and the value production that is going to help us to define what I call structural models, which are the ones that I start to discuss in more depth to recognize whether they can be autonomous units or not. So many of these units that are value units in the environment may not be autonomous. It may not be something that the enterprise may recognize as autonomous and as part of its autonomy. But I think in the end, I am accepting very much the idea that there are many tools and many forms of working out autonomous units.
Okay. Okay, thank you for your responses, Raul. Very interesting to watch the presentation.
Thank you, Arthur, and thank you, Raul. We have a comment also from Hugh.
From whom?
Hugh
Lloyd.
Hugh Lloyd.
Hugh Lloyd. Yes, Hugh.
He may have gone. So I think that we'll go to the next one. Czeslaw, would you want to make your comment?
So I have a problem because right now I'm working on a book project on complexity and agile. And I'm browsing the literature on complex interpretation from Gelman to Luma, And my question to Professor Espejo is, which interpretation of complexity is relevant to this model? Because it could be somehow arbitrary. Because as a matter of fact, we may have several definitions. So which interpretation, how do you interpret complexity in functional terms in this case? Maybe I don't know it. So just my question is not naive, because as I've said that I've browsed those different interpretations of complexity. How do you understand complexity in this case?
I think the way that I understand complexity is inbuilt in the whole idea of organizational cybernetics, and it is the idea of variety. So the idea of variety, or the number of possible states of a situation, is one that I have worked, and I did mention at the beginning, very much at the beginning, that I have developed a huge amount of work along the lines of the idea of variety and variety management. And that's something that Stafford called in his work variety engineering. And that's the way in which we manage complexity. And what is quite interesting is that if you see the number of possible states that our organizations and systems deal with are very much digitalizable. They can be produced in digital terms. And that's where I think at the end of the day, the variety that we see in the situation is the variety that can be expressed through different forms of managing complexity in terms of technology, in terms of functions, in terms of a number of things. Does it help you?
Thank you very much. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you, Czeslaw and Raul. We have Steve Ruiz.
Yeah. Why is it that I don't see anybody? Is that you're making my life difficult?
Yeah, I'm talking away there, Angela. I didn't realize I was muted. I've been asking a few questions and everybody's been ignoring me. I've been on mute all of this time. Sorry. Yeah. Yeah, Raul, I've got maybe a couple of questions. I mean, I've got lots of questions, but I've got to be fair to others on the call. I noticed that you hadn't even had System 3-star marked in one of your diagrams. And over the experience I've gained over the past, number of years working for BT, I've since retired from BT and I work on my own now, is System 3-star can have a big impact on reducing complexity. And one of those ways of reducing complexity, of course, is to do with standardization. If we haven't got standard sort of processes, right, it means that everything else someone does is different. And if they're different, we develop a different language for what we're doing. And it means really it reduces the effectiveness of communications. So I see the 3-star has helped me to be able to move forward significantly in the work that I'm doing at the moment in America. Because I use System 3-star. With feedback, I work in IT and data all the time, so I build these tools that enable us to look at differences between the processes so I can align them. So my methodology here, Raul, is to try to standardize before I mechanize. So I standardize, I mechanize. Mechanization is not automation. Mechanization is just where we have a script and we can work from. And if we can successfully work from that script, we stand a chance of being able to automate the process. And then I move forward from automation to autonomization, where I'm starting to use machine learning, genetic algorithms, and AI in that overall process. But that all starts with System 3-star, enabling me to be able to standardize the processes, even to a certain degree, standardize the languages that we use so we can communicate more effectively. So I develop a new language using cybernetics about the organization. As an example, I'll talk about silos as being low variety amplifiers. The amplifiers, because they can't constrain, they're low variety, so they haven't got sufficient constraints to be able to constrain their output. So again, that also helps complexity to proliferate. So what I've got to do now is to try to bring the silos together. So I've got the issue of integration. How do I integrate the silos? But that's all well and good. But remember, I'm increasing complexity. So again, I've got to use sort of IT to help them to understand how they can talk together, because that discussion is going to be mediated by a model of their interactions. So I've then got integration, but integration amplifies variety. Then I've got another problem. I've got a problem of differentiation. How do I create distinctions in this massive, effectively search space that I've actually generated? So yeah, I was just, that's the sort of the area that I'm very much into at the moment, talking about these things. So now I've got the concept of a high variety attenuator. When I do this integration, when I've got these integrations. So I've just thought, have you thought about looking at these sorts of ideas or areas in the way when you're building organizations?
Of course, Steve. Clearly, yes. And I didn't use the word 3-star, but I did use the idea of audits, and I did use the idea of trust. Mm-hmm. So that I wasn't pushing for automation there, by no means. What I was doing there was saying, one thing I don't like when I see that people add 3-star as a 6th function of the viable system model. And that, in my view, is not correct. And therefore, what I think is correct is you are the way you were talking to me suggests that you are pushing these precise ideas, and that is that trust and many other forms of emotions that are necessary generate the support to work out negotiations of resources, and and together with system 2 coordination is that they create the whole process of resources bargaining that I explained as one of the relationships that I wanted you to follow me in the conversation. So I think, Steve, we are very much in tune.
Yeah. Okay, thanks for that, Raul.
Thank you, Steve and Raul. We have Mike. Mike Jackson wants to.
Yeah, hi, Raul.
Right.
I'm not sure what third order cybernetics means either, but I suspect it's something to do with the relationship between ideas like cybernetic models and society at large, which is a complex issue. And I wonder whether the notion of organizational citizenship actually is enough to address that issue. Let me give you an example. I mean, I like the notion of enterprise complexity model. I'm trying to think of it in terms of health and how you'd have to reconfigure resources, relationships, and interactions to produce a health system, if people could agree on what that would be like. And obviously that's taking the National Health Service, it's taking the private health sector, it's taking the market system, which is embedded now in the National Health Service, it's taking the care system, and there are so many different stakeholders, so many different interests, societal interests embedded there, some profit making, others public service related. So, I mean, this issue of the relationship between the model and society and how you manage to bring about an enterprise complexity model to deal with an issue such as health seems to me deserving of considerable attention, whether you regard that as third order cybernetics or something else.
Well, I think, Mike, I couldn't agree more with you. And clearly, that's what Levsky calls third order cybernetics. And he has developed a whole range of models to support the interactions of all aspects of ethics, aspects of society, aspects of building up trust and so on in organizations, in society and organizations. So I think that area is one that, as you saw there, I didn't want to go into that because I think in itself is a hugely demanding and complex area for discussion and development of. What we have to work out is some forms of mechanisms which in a way are soft enough to connect society and organizations. And that's something that I still think we need to build up. So clearly there is, and that's what I finished by telling that the relationship 5 of organizational citizenship is precisely the one where I see this connection of society to organizational systems. Am I helping you or not saying much?
No, it's fine. The notion of organizational citizenship clearly needs, as you probably could if you had time, need more defining. But I understand that that's where you're trying to deal with that particular issue.
Yes, yes, and I think there is a full paper about that.
Okay.
Well, thank you, Mike and Raul. We have Javier Libes.
Oh, I'm so glad that I'm seeing these people in front of me now.
Hello.
Hello, Javier.
Okay, can you see
So
me?
am I to see you all. Thanks for the host.
Sorry, who is speaking there?
Hello.
That was Gerhard Krust from
Oh,
Vienna.
Heracles. Yes, indeed.
Okay, glad to see you. A
Very
great lecture. Thank you.
good to see you.
Can I speak now?
Yes, please. Yes, yes.
Can you see me?
Yes.
I'm seeing you.
Okay. Well, my comment is congratulations, Raul. I coincide a lot with your viewpoint, and I want to say why. I think we all are here together because we sense that we have an obligation towards Stafford so that his ideas become mainstream, okay? I don't doubt that there are many contributions from you, Raul, to the world and the way you have been applying this, and many other contributions, Steve and Jose Perez Rios and all our friends. You know, you've made enormous contributions. But I'm worried that we have to center more on the viable system, not in its super general purpose, but in the specific applications for governments and for private enterprises, and as you say now, perhaps private-public partnerships, okay? Because the world is running faster than we are, and we have to catch up. And there are some changes that I think that Raul suggests or implies that I have put into what I call the universal management, governance and management system, which is very much like Raul's in the sense that I don't worry anymore about whether beehives or a herd of cattle or horses acts like a viable system, okay? I'm not interested in the biological examples which it works for, like a cell or an organ or a tissue or whatever. I think we have to concentrate on making this available for the general public, for the, let's say, everyday manager. And there are some things that we have to change. For instance, Stafford baptized the audit as audit, okay? And I think that audit is not a very good name. I suggest, for instance, calling it error detection system, okay? Error can be anything that goes against the proper operation of the system. And this is why I understand that Steve has found that System 3, which can be called System 3, but I call error detection, can realize that there's a lot of standardization that is not being done. And you can have, because to me, standardization is located in System 2, because it is about agreements, it is about standards, about plans, about agendas, everything that has to do with some sort of information processing that is not of an authoritarian type. So, but then Steve says, okay, I found this using System 3. Well, because he is thinking of System 3 as an error detection mechanism, okay? So you can say, we have different softwares in the same company.
Yeah.
We could unite them all under one single type of software, okay?
Ya, los dientes, ya, voy. Y tú no te has cortado las uñas, Federico.
So it would be detected at a audit or System 3, or what I call error detection, and not detected at a System 2, which is a very specific thing.
Javier,
Okay?
Javier, you heard me talking about the cohesion relationship. You heard me
Yes.
talking about the integration of the resources bargaining with coordination and audit. And you heard me saying that rather than audit, I use the notion of trust. What I think is, for me, the most interesting part of the interactions between the cohesive function people and the autonomous people of the units is the most important thing that is to work out that in fact people are expressing their own views and interests in forms that are not supported by the idea of standardization or the idea of corrective action, are supported by the idea of understanding each other, understanding the different levels. And the more you achieve understanding between cohesion people and operational people, the more you will improve the conditions for the running of the enterprise. And
Yes.
if that is achieved not by imposing particular values, then I think we are moving towards reducing complexity in the relationship and
Yes.
improving the quality of this relationship.
Yes.
So that's what I was trying to say.
I agree totally, Raul. I don't know if I just heard a conference by a Chilean colleague of ours, Lavanderos. I don't know if you're familiar with his work, but I could send you the presentation he made a few days ago. Okay, but in his case, he is placing trust and all those values in the identity system. Okay, and if you're talking about a big system like the nation state, it would be great if we all agreed in everything and all the values. Stafford used to say, if we have a society for loving each other, then everything flows perfectly. But if you're going to rob a bank, then everybody has to fulfill the purpose exactly mechanically, you know, or else it won't work. So what I'm trying to say is that the audit, system 3, error detection function has to be in place all the time, because we are not a nation of saints, and we have somebody has to take care of making sure that everything is done by the book, you know, unfortunately.
Sorry, it's coming you from Mexico. I really think that what you're saying is more than necessary.
Yes, well, that's the real world.
However, I'll tell you that the interesting part of all this that we are talking about are that we need to understand relationships, and how is that we are managing these relationships in ways that we increase the chances of good performance. And that's something that I connected to the notion of variety engineering. And I think there is plenty that we can do. And your arguments are somehow supporting the notion of variety engineering.
Yes, I agree that we should think of ideal systems, but for instance, I see all the administration of justice in a nation state as part of the error detection network. Okay.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting issue, that one. And I would say, yeah, I think we need to first of all recognize which is the organizational system, what is the system in focus, and it is from there that we can start working what is the role of the justice system in that situation, and it is there that we can work out more the type of relationships that are going to help to improve fairness and justice.
Well, the point I wanted to make, I've already made, and you answered it very correctly. And thank you for your contribution.
Thank you.
Thank you, Javier and Raul. We had a comment from James Fox, but I don't know if he's still around. Yes, James. Okay.
Hi, yeah, I'm here, but I was just replying to Stephen in the comments. I don't have a specific question, but I really appreciated the talk, Raul, and everyone's comments and questions. Thank you.
Thank you, James. We have Stephen Harwood.
Where is Steve? That's very, very good to hear that you're here, Steve.
He was here, but he may have gone because he's not responding. Yeah. So I think that we will continue. John Waters.
Sorry, I've got nothing really to add to the question I put in the comments. If anyone can answer it, I'd be grateful. I wasn't expecting an answer. I just wanted to throw the question in because it does puzzle me.
So you are not asking me a question. You're asking a question to the whole group.
I'm asking, yes. Anyone who can answer that for me, I'd be very grateful.
The problem for me is that I know what you're asking.
You say you do know or don't know?
I'm not seeing the chat.
Oh, right. Okay. I've never felt comfortable with the distinction between first and second order cybernetics because two systems observing each other are observing a system that's observed the original observer. Now, that takes us past the concept of third order cybernetics, as I see it naively, to a concept of infinite order cybernetics direction. I just want to get some understanding of why it stops at some kind of terminal turtle rather than being turtles all the way down.
I'm sorry, I think my understanding of that is what I explained in the presentation. I said that first order cybernetics is the cybernetics of the observed system. Is that when we observe an input-output situation and we say that's the observed situation. The second order cybernetics is when the people who are contributing to a situation are exchanging their views and interactions, and they are changing the way in which the input-output machine operates, so that in second order cybernetics, there is no what from Faust called the trivial machine. There is no trivial machine. You have strictly you have a machine that is non-trivial, and non-trivial means that as you transform inputs into outputs, the way things come to the process change the very meaning of what was going on. And that is characteristic of second order cybernetics. And this is the reason it is the cybernetics of observing systems. And beyond that, I don't see the need for anything more.
Okay. Whether or not there's a need, it might be there anyway, but I don't think this is the time to discuss this.
Right.
Thank you, John. We have two final questions and one from me. We have a Christian, then Marcus, and then Patricia.
Yeah. Yes, Raul, it was great. Do you hear me?
Yes, Marcus. Not only I hear
I just want to say that it was good getting from you tonight a condensed version of the results of 50 years of, well, trial and error, but also reflection, and I would say successful reflection. My question here is, you are using Y-plan methodology and Y-plan method. Could you elaborate on the difference and on the relations?
Thank you, Marcos. I think, as usual, we have very good communications. Marcos, I think the distinction that I am making there is in the case of first order cybernetics. As you know, we are looking at input-output, and that's what we experience. But with non-trivial machines, we don't experience that. There is a change. So can you repeat your question, please?
My question was, you are using the terms Viplan methodology and Viplan method.
Yes.
Could you elaborate on the difference and on the relationship between the two?
Well, I did show through the presentation the relationship between the two, because while Viplan method is essentially handling black boxes and the way in which the inputs are transformed into outputs, the other second order the Viplan methodology is essentially about relationships, and these relationships that are happening both at the level of what we would call the cybernetic loop and the learning loop. And in both cases, what you have is something that goes beyond the first order level. And that's where you need to understand each other and see what are the observations in each case.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marcos and Raul. We have a final question from Patricio.
From?
Patricio?
Patrick?
No, Patricio.
Patricio. Hello.
Patricio?
Yeah.
Yeah.
¿Yo tiene Patricio?
Yes. Is the audio okay?
Yes, I can hear you, but are you of Spanish language or not?
Yeah, yes, I am. We talked a few weeks ago.
Yes, you are the Argentinian. That's the reason I'm asking you.
Yeah, yes, I am the Argentinian. Yes. But since we all speak English, I will make the question in English. So first of all, thanks for all the content and sharing your work. My question is quite specific on the concrete experience of application of the BS model. Particularly, you mentioned in a few slides ago, you mentioned that one of the most significant applications was the one on the National Auditing Office of Colombia. And I would like to ask you, and this could extend also to Angela, what are the key learnings from this experience? And if you see any bottleneck or any limitations on this implementation, and what do you think would be the room for improvements? And as a side question, do you see any room for the leverage of open and participatory mechanisms of innovation to enhance citizen and worker participation in innovation when it comes to a network of public enterprises? Or do you see bottlenecks on that, and which and why? That's the question.
Well, I think very powerful questions. And clearly, Angela can give good answers to that as well. I think, by the way, a paper is coming soon explaining what you are asking for. So rather than going through all these details, I can tell you that work in what was the Colombian project was very, very significant, very, very important, and had many learnings. And that's one of the things that I cannot explain to you now, but I can only tell you that it will come. The second aspect is, as we are talking about networks of enterprises happen in a context. They cannot happen in isolation, because the variety of that would be impossible. And it is there that you have to pay attention to workers' requirements, workers' needs, and all of that. And I would love to see much more work done in that, what I call the organizational citizenship relationship, work much more in that direction. And that's perhaps something that you can do.
Awesome.
Well, thank you, Patricia and Raul. Very briefly, I can tell you in summary, what I think that was very important from this project. I think it was the first time that we tried to develop a more systemic way of measuring performance in the public sector. And the traditional way was very split between very technical measurements of auditing. So they have like informatics auditing and financial auditing and environmental auditing and so far. And it was always seen like from an external perspective. And in the way that we did it in the National Auditing Office, we managed to devolve responsibility to each one of the companies to participate and get involved in assessing their performance. They did it in a much more systemic way. And it created a really interesting learning process, because then people could focus on trying to understand what were really the most predominant structural constraints they have to perform effectively. So it was really interesting. There was an enormous learning in terms of people learning to think that way. And after that, we created an MSc in Los Andes University to educate auditors in this way of thinking. And as far as I understand, I don't know if it's still going on, but it was going on for many years after that, and continue having an impact in the way of thinking. So that, I think that was very important. Limitations of that project, as usual, political. We did great while we were there, while we have all the political supports of the then leaders of the National Auditing Office. But it always happens when there is a new government and new people coming in, then these kind of efforts normally don't necessarily survive into the next government periods. But there is still many people that participated in this project that have continued doing, distributing these learnings. So I think that it did have some important effects anyway. Okay, so that's all from me, Patricio, and thank you for the question. We have, I have one final question for Raul, and it's when you explain the enterprise complexity model, you do say in your presentation that it is like a distributed governance model or an ecology of networked enterprises. But you also say later in the presentation that the enterprise complexity model is an enterprise strategy to manage complexity in a highly dynamic market. So I just want to clarify if in your mind, this is basically a governance model, a distributed governance model, or as well a strategy to manage complexity.
Angela, I like very much your question, and I think in the end, what I have proposed is that we deal with a network of enterprises, but not in isolation, one from the other, but basically as part of an organizational system that is relevant to the issues or the problematic situations that we are dealing with. And it is there that the generation of this network through communications and information is that can help to generate some governance processes that in the end, they don't try to make them unique. They don't try to separate one from the other, but they try to see basic forms of connecting and generating the mutual support and collaboration that would be helpful. And that's what I connect to the idea of governance.
And that means necessarily that the only way that you can create this partnership, this cohesive network of enterprises, interested in working in such a way is if they have this idea of citizenship, these values, they are sharing values, they are, let's say, working at the next level of recursion and not only interested in their own individual outputs, isn't it?
Yes, yes, I think we are clearly the connection of all these networks of enterprises and the problems of policy, purpose, cohesion, and integration and participation of the people from the environment into the challenges that are required to be handled by the organization all come together. And that's what we would recognize as a governance process.
Thank you, Raul. We have a final question. We are running a little bit late, so thanks for all of you who stayed a bit longer. Felipe Montes wants to ask a final question. Felipe?
Felipe, what are you doing there?
Hi, Raul. How are you? I was invited by Angela to this Metaphorum. I'm very happy for being here and see you.
I can see that Angela moves around, yes.
So, Raul, I want to ask just a question. And what do you think is the main challenge to overcome in this networked enterprise to achieve consensus for decision making?
Why do you put this question at the end of the whole thing?
Because no, it's just one in your experience, maybe not so theoretical, maybe in your experience.
Unfortunately, in my experience, the answer is not straightforward. It is clear that to achieve some degree of consensus and agreement and so on is something that is extremely difficult. And the only thing that I can say is that if we use the idea of the enterprise complexity model, we increase the chances of building up networks of communications, networks of support that will help to increase the response to the situations that we are dealing with. But one thing that I'm clear is that the response to these problems that we are experiencing is going to require far more than an enterprise complexity model.
Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you, Raul. Really interesting talk and really interesting comments from all of you. I think that we have had a great session. So anyway, unless there is someone who wants to say something else, I think that we are ready. Okay, so next webinar is Martin Pittner, who was around here, and it's going to be next week at the same time, at the same channel, at the same link. So looking forward to see you, to have you with us next week, okay? And thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela, for organizing all of this.
Yeah. You can, you will see the recording in the Metaphorum webpage. So have a want to see the recording and the presentation, okay?
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Yeah, thank you, Angela.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.